Well, good morning. I am excited to kind of do a little preview for our next series, which is going to be called Tend, on tending to our souls and really focusing on soul care. And this morning, what I'm going to do is what I learned in Brussels is called an amuse-bouche. This is one of our favorite terms that we learned in Brussels, which was you go to a nice restaurant and you'd have the menu and you'd order your main meal, and then the waitress would come back, or waiter would come back around, and they would serve you what was called an amuse-bouche, which was usually just one bite of something. And they would serve it, compliments of the chef, they would say. And first it was kind of like, we were like, this is the smallest appetizer we ever had. And we realized, like, no, it's not an appetizer. You can order those. This is just something to kind of get your taste buds going. The idea is kind of like you taste this one free thing, and it's so good that you go, I can't wait for the main course to come, right? So this is just the amuse-bouche. This is just to kind of get you going for the main course, the series that's going to be coming up on caring for our souls. And historically, as we think about the idea of the soul, theologically in Christian tradition, the soul is made up of the mind, the will, and the emotions. And I want to focus this morning on the emotions. Honestly, this is one of the bigger challenges of spiritual maturity for my life, is kind of processing my emotions, understanding my emotions, being able to express my emotions. And so as I was reflecting on what I might add to this time as we prepare for our series, I thought, let's just dive in a little bit to this area of weakness in my life and ask the question, what does Christ-like emotional maturity look like in the life of a disciple? Because one of the great truths, I think, that we recognize in life, the older you get, is that growing old is no guarantee of growing up. There's a lot of older people in your life that are very immature in a lot of ways, right? Youth fades, but immaturity kind of lingers, And even today, I said to Callie as her boys are running around, like, they do grow up eventually, But in reality, they grow old. We hope they grow up eventually, and we hope through good parenting there'll be a maturity that comes. But this sort of perpetual immaturity in adults is something that I think is easy to see in others and hard to see in ourselves. But one of the ways that immaturity comes out in the life of a Christian is when we get squeezed. I had this old mentor who had this beautiful phrase where he'd say, if you squeeze an orange, you get orange juice. You squeeze a lemon, you get lemon juice. If you squeeze a Christian, you never know what you're going to get. But whatever comes out is what they're filled with. Right? And I think often in our lives as followers of Jesus, we get squeezed, and one of the things that comes out is unhealthy expressions of emotion. Tantrums, outbursts, maybe the opposite. Rather than coming at someone, maybe it's more of the shame-induced withdrawal. Whether we tend to be more aggressive or more passive, but in that emotional outburst we have when we get squeezed, we often are given a glimpse into our heart, and we don't often love what comes out. And so we don't want to just grow old as disciples. We want to grow up. We want to mature in all aspects of our lives, all aspects of our soul, including our emotional health. So emotional maturity is the process of becoming more developed or complete in our emotions. And I want to celebrate that it is a process. And thank goodness that we are all in process. Maturity is not a place we arrive at. It's a goal. Just like Christ's likeness is not something that we ultimately achieve on this side of heaven. But the sanctification journey of becoming more like Christ, or becoming more mature, is something that the Spirit is doing in all of us. And this is just one of the areas of my life that I feel like I'm always in process. I'm never mature. I'm just maturing. I look back on years in the past and I think, well, I'm not who I was. I'm not who I want to be, but thank goodness I'm not still who I was. I'm in process. TD mentioned a couple weeks ago that 4-quadrant tool that I love, of kind of 4 different ways to connect with God: think, feel, be, and do. My primary orientation to God has always been kind of a thinking orientation and a doing orientation. I love studying the scriptures. I love reading C.S. Lewis. I love good, meaningful discussions. And then I love getting my hands dirty. I love serving others. I love when groups come together and take action for the kingdom. That is an easy way where I sense God is in our midst. But honestly, I really struggle with this idea of feeling things towards God, or feeling God's feelings even towards me. It's very hard for me to kind of integrate my spirituality into this emotional world, and sometimes even to just be aware of what I'm feeling. My family loves a story, or my wife loves a story. And she has told us at many a dinner party when emotions come up of one time at a soul care retreat in Brussels when we were living there and serving as church planters. An outside person came in to kind of lead a 2-day retreat for our team on emotional health. And she said, hey, let's just as a little warm up, just kind of get going here. Let's just go around the room, around the circle, and just share an emotion. You know, picks one person there. Some person said, happy. Oh, there we go. Yeah. Next one, sad. Great. Angry. Perfect. Then it came to me. And I was like, wait, what do we say? Happy, sad, angry. Hungry. I was like, hungry. She's like, no, not really. I was like, oh, okay. Not tired. No, those are really more like physical sensations. I was like, pass. Next. I'm like, we already said happy, sad, angry. I don't know what other emotions there are, you know? And then I was like blown away while it just kept going on. Like, oh my gosh, you guys, your vocabulary for emotions is incredible. And so then, you know, even in marriage back here in LA, Kristen will have these moments where she'll say like, I can tell you've had a rough day or something's going on. What's going on? What are you feeling? And I don't know. And what I naturally do is start telling her what I'm thinking about. Well, I was thinking about this and I was thinking about that. She goes, yeah, but what are you feeling? I'm like, I don't know. I don't know what I'm feeling, okay? And so we literally printed out this feelings chart. I took it off my fridge. How do I feel right now? It's just a bunch of like faces, you know, it's got the classic happy face, but there's like 40 different emotions on here, you know? And so I'll be like, I don't know, get the chart. And I'm like, I'm enraged. There it is. That's the word I'm looking for. I'm puzzled. Why did they do that today? That drives me crazy. You know, I'm smug. So I don't really get a lot of smug in there, but like this literally has helped my vocabulary around emotions to be able to walk by and look at it and go, okay, these are emotions, not just hungry, tired, but I can experience these things and I am experiencing them, and then how do I learn to express them? Daniel Goleman, who has written kind of one of the classic reference books on this idea of emotional maturity, it's called Emotional Intelligence. He identifies 8 primary emotions: anger, sadness, fear, enjoyment, love, disgust, surprise, and shame. And again, all those emotions, regardless of what sort of natural reaction you have when you hear that, they're not identified as good or bad. They just are. Their emotions are not inherently right or wrong. It's what we do with them that ultimately becomes right or wrong, and how we think and respond about them. But to be able to have language to process the difference between disgust and surprise, or shame and fear, is really important. And so maturity for us begins first by being aware of my emotions, and then secondly, taking responsibility for them. Maturity says, I know what I'm feeling, and I'm responsible for it, and I'm responsible for what I do as a result of it. When you do X, I may feel Y, but you doing X does not make me feel Y. This is what often happens with kids, right? Well, why did you hit him? Well, he made me angry. And what they're really saying is, I had no, Dad, come on, seriously. I mean, what are we supposed to do? They made me angry. When you're angry, you punch someone. Like, it was out of my control. That's immaturity. Immaturity says your behavior caused me to feel something that I wasn't in control of. No. What I identify is when you did something, I felt something in response, but I'm responsible for that emotion. Because the problem with that losing your sense of agency, that when you do X, you cause me to feel Y, right? It's your fault. The problem then is what you've done is you've made someone else's behavior the problem and the solution. So it basically means your behavior is the problem, but the only solution is for your behavior to change. You make me angry. Well, how will I be happy? When you stop making me angry. When you change your behavior, then I'll be happy. And now I'm out of control. Literally, I don't have control of my emotions anymore. I'm waiting for someone else to change. And this is so often what emotional immaturity looks like in ourselves and in the lives of others. We're blaming others. We're waiting for them to take a different stance, a different posture, a different action so that we can feel a different way. And it's crazy making. We end up feeling helpless. And that sort of emotional maturity is so common in kids. It's common as kids reflect on their day, but sadly it's all too common in adults too. And so we don't want to just grow old. We want to grow up, and we want to grow in this idea of maturity. But let's first just kind of identify a couple areas of emotional immaturity that jump out in some case studies in Scripture. Emotional immaturity is when instead of having a grip on our emotions, they have a grip on us. I want to look at the lives of 3 biblical characters, and I just realized they're all men, but no comment on all 3 men being the emotional maturity examples. But Therapist Callie could tell you that men do, I think, struggle more often with processing their emotions and expressing them. But the lives of three biblical characters and identify some patterns of emotional immaturity, and then we'll just contrast that to the life of Jesus. So 3 expressions of emotional immaturity. Number 1, I ignore emotions. Let's look at the case study of Cain in Genesis chapter 4. I'll read this text here. Adam made love to his wife Eve, and she became pregnant and gave birth to Cain. She said, with help of the Lord, I have brought forth a man. Later, she gave birth to his brother Abel. Now, Abel kept flocks, and Cain worked the soil. In the course of time, Cain brought some of the fruits of the ground as an offering to the Lord, and Abel also brought an offering, fat portions from some of the firstborn of his flock. The Lord looked with favor on Abel and his offering, but on Cain and his offering he did not look with favor. So Cain was very angry, and his face was downcast. Now, most scholars agree that this is not meant to be God's reflection of his, love of meat over fruit or something like that. This is not a vegetarian carnivore comment. This is more primarily about the nature of the gift. In the details, it says that Abel's gift was the best. It was the fat portions from the firstborn. It was the best meat from the firstborn of the flock. He was offering to God an acceptable act of worship that showed his posture of reverence towards God. He gave a gift that basically showed God what he thought God was worth. Whereas Cain brings fruit from the ground. I think maybe a better way to say that would be like the overripe fruit that has fallen on the ground. Right? You want to go get an apple, a fresh apple, you pick an apple off a tree that looks ripe. You don't just go kind of grab one on the ground that may have already had bugs on it. It was so ripe it fell. So he's giving leftovers versus Abel who's giving the best. And so the Lord is honored by Abel's sacrifice and not Cain's. And so the Lord responds appropriately to these 2 different acts of worship. But Cain is very angry because of God's response. So then the text continues. Then the Lord said to Cain, why are you angry? And why is your face downcast? If you do well, will not your countenance be lifted up? And if you do not do well, sin is crouching at the door, and its desire is for you, but you must master it. 2 things he's doing: raising awareness, what are you feeling? And then reminding him that what you're feeling is important because your actions come out of it. Why are you, it's such a great therapist question. Why are you angry? We've said this before. I know I've said this right here on the stage. God doesn't ask questions because he lacks information. He's not like curious in that sense of like, I don't know the answer. He knows the answer. He raises questions to raise awareness in you, not to get information. He's basically saying, why are you angry, Cain? What's going on? Are you aware of what's going on inside of you? Let's talk about it. Let's process it. It's an invitation for a relational encounter around his emotions. You're in control of your emotions, and you're in control of the actions that come out of it, Cain. Let's process that now. But he also has this warning, but you better get in touch with what you're feeling. Because if you don't, your anger can turn into sin. You better get a grip on your emotions, or else they are going to have a grip on you. Don't ignore what you're feeling. But that's exactly what Cain does. Cain doesn't respond at all in the text to God directly. Instead, the next verse says, now Cain said to his brother Abel. Such a contrast. God speaking to Cain. Cain's supposed to return the words to God, but he doesn't. He goes to Abel instead. And he says, let's go out in the field. And while they were in the field, Cain attacked his brother Abel and killed him. Then the Lord said to Cain, where is your brother Abel? I don't know, he replied. Am I my brother's keeper? Stuffed emotions will inevitably affect our relationships in destructive ways. He ignores his emotion, he stuffs it, and instead of that thing being buried, it climbs up out of the grave and causes him to do something that he never could have imagined doing, most likely before that moment. Ephesians has a great passage that I'm sure you've heard many times. Don't let the sun go down on your anger. Right? The idea, again, being that if you take the anger you experience in a day and you keep it with you while you go to sleep, you bury it, you ignore it, in the morning it's not just anger, it's fermented into something else. It's turned into bitterness. It's gotten worse, so to speak. Sleep doesn't make it better. It makes it worse. And it has a way of doing damage to others. Now, sometimes in our ignoring of emotions, we don't stuff. Sometimes we feel it, but then we don't know how to express it, and so we mask it as something else. And honestly, this was kind of my way of growing up with my own challenges in childhood. I had 6 parents, multiple divorces, multiple affairs, a lot of brokenness in my home. I was the oldest child with 6 younger siblings. I was very often kind of the surrogate parent around wherever I was. And so there was a lot of pain involved in that. And so I didn't really know how to handle that pain or express that pain or sadness. And so I just learned to kind of mask it. And the first time that this ever came up was I met with a therapist in college. My mom told me she was aware enough to say, you probably need to get some therapy in life, and therapy's free in college. Why don't you go meet with the therapist? And so I met, and the therapist simply said, first day, let's do, what do they call it, a genealogy? Genogram. Draw yourself, draw your mom and dad, draw like, oh, this is going to be good, right? And what I had realized was I had taken my family story and turned it into like a tight 5 comedy routine, okay? Like I had punchlines, I had payoffs, I had callbacks. It was so good, right? I was like, hey, my family tree is not a tree, it's a bush. It goes up and goes wide. And I'm like, in my mind, I'm killing. I've told this story at dinner parties and people are laughing. Every time people want to get to know me. And this therapist is just staring me down as I go through. I'm like, man, they're not laughing. This is funny stuff. I've been working on this for a long time, And he finally interrupts me, and he goes, John, none of this is funny. Humor is not an appropriate emotion right now. I will allow you to feel sadness or anger as you tell this story, but I will not allow you to tell it in a way that is funny any longer. I'm telling you, it was like someone had just pulled corks out of I just started crying. I was just like, what? No one in my life had ever named the appropriate emotion for my story. I was just masking with what felt safe to me, which was humor. And man, that started me. I was like, I'm coming back every week. We're going to work through this stuff. I'm a mess. And to this point, like lifelong pursuit of therapy and counseling and growing in my own understanding of maturity and having charts if I need it, whatever it is, so that I'm able to label and identify what am I feeling. How do I not ignore it, not stuff it, not mask it, but express it? Pete Scazzaro, in a great book called The Emotionally Healthy Church, says that the way of spiritual life, sadly, has become to deny anger, ignore pain, skip over depression, run from loneliness, avoid confusing doubts, and turn off our sexuality. Ignoring our emotions is turning our back on reality. Listening to our emotions ushers us into reality, and reality is the only place we can meet God. And so much of my own emotional maturity has added to my areas of spiritual maturity as I've encountered God in those places. All right, second expression of emotional immaturity. Not only do I ignore emotions, but I indulge emotions. I think Judas is a great case study for this in Matthew chapter 26. Here's a story of Judas and the disciples being with Jesus while he's out doing ministry. I'm sure you're familiar with this story. But it says, while Jesus was in Bethany at the home of Simon the leper, a woman came to him with an alabaster vial of very costly perfume, and she poured it on his head as he reclined at the table. But the disciples were indignant when they saw this, and they said, why this waste? For this perfume may have been sold for a high price and the money given to the poor. But Jesus, aware of this, said to them, why do you bother the woman? For she has done a good deed to me. For you will always have the poor with you, but you do not always have me. For when she poured this perfume on my body, she did it to prepare me for burial. And truly I say to you, wherever the gospel is preached in the whole world, what this woman has done will also be spoken in memory of her. Then one of the 12, named Judas Iscariot, went to the chief priests and said, what are you willing to give me to betray him to you? And they weighed out 30 pieces of silver. And from then on, he began looking for a good opportunity to betray Jesus. Now, in this passage, it makes it sound like there is an unknown person or maybe a group of people in the disciples who are saying, why this waste? In the parallel passage in John just goes out and calls Judas out. In John 12, it says that Judas did not say this because he cared about the poor, but because he was a thief. And as a keeper of the money bag, he used to help himself to what was put into it. So Judas is like, oh my gosh, that alabaster vial of perfume, we could have sold that and had so much more money for the ministry. And by the ministry, I mean also me, because I'm skimming off the top of it. And so in that moment, in his kind of reaction of frustration, he makes a suggestion to his boss. Have you ever had this moment where you're in a meeting and you make a suggestion to your boss publicly? Hey, why don't we do it this way? I got a great idea. And suddenly you know that like that idea is going to help you, you know. Hey, what about a 4-day work week, boss? Have you ever thought about that, you know? And you just kind of throw it out. And then maybe quickly, a little too abruptly, your boss goes, no, we're not doing that. And in that moment, you're like, oh, that hurt. Oh, I'm embarrassed. Maybe I feel a little shame. Maybe I feel a little put down, right? And all of a sudden you start having this stir up. Well, Judas has that moment. He basically raises an objection to what Jesus is doing. He thinks he's suggesting something, and Jesus shuts him down. And Judas is so overwhelmed by that emotional experience that he indulges the feeling, and immediately he goes out and finds a way to betray him. And there's such a rashness, a hot-headedness. I mean, this is the finance guy. This is the guy of all the disciples they trust with the money, right? And you notice what he does? He goes to the Pharisees, and he's like, what will you give me to betray him? This is not a strong bargaining position. You know, what will you give me to do this thing? He's not entering into it with any of his intellectual background as a financial person. He's just making a rash, emotional decision based on his shame, maybe his anger, maybe his own sense of greed. And the irony of this rash, emotional indulgence is that once he realizes what he's done, once his emotions calm down and he realizes that he just sold out his rabbi, he runs back to those same men trying to give back the coins and trying to change everything, and they say no. And then the emotions come up in him again of shame. What have I done? And he literally goes and kills himself. And the two things we know Judas for are both actions that he does out of the overwhelming response to emotions. Judas is not in control of his emotions. They control him, to catastrophic consequences in both situations. Some ignore, some indulge. The third habit is I isolate emotionally from others. I think Jonah is a great case study for this. We know the story of Jonah. God calls Jonah as a prophet to go to Nineveh and proclaim that the Ninevites need to repent, but Jonah, based on his own racial and ethnic bias against the Ninevites, he hates the Ninevites. He doesn't want to do this. He goes in the opposite direction. He ends up in the belly of a fish for 3 days, eventually decides, I better go or else things will not go well for me. But he goes without his heart being in it, and it says that he simply proclaims that you have to repent. It's the worst sermon you'll probably see in the whole Bible. His heart's not in it at all, but he's like, I got to say this thing God told me to say. And then incredibly in Jonah 3:5, the people of Nineveh believed in God. They called a fast. They put on sackcloth from the greatest to the least of them. And then in Jonah 4, it says, but it greatly displeased Jonah, and he became angry. And he prayed to the Lord. He said, Lord, isn't this what I said when I was still in my own country? This is why I didn't want to come here. I didn't want them to repent. I don't want them to receive your compassion. I want them to burn. Therefore, in order to forestall this, I fled to Tarshish, for I knew that you were a gracious and compassionate God, slow to anger and abundant in loving kindness, that you are one who relents concerning calamity. Therefore now, O Lord, take my life from me, for death is better to me than life. And again, the Lord's question to him, do you really have good reason to be angry? Engaging him on the emotion that he's experiencing, not invalidating it, but saying, can we process it? Can we talk about it? And then it says that Jonah went up on the hill so that he could see what would happen to the city, implying hopefully maybe that God's still going to rain down fire and destroy this whole city. It doesn't happen. And then God comes back to Jonah and says, do you have a good reason to be angry? Oh, you remember this little story where while he's up there, it's really hot. And then this plant, God causes the plant to grow up and give him shade. And so he's really happy. And he's like, thank goodness it's cool. And then the plant dies. And then he is really sad about the plant. It's a living metaphor, basically. And God says, do you have any reason to be angry about the plant dying? He goes, yeah, I have good reason to be angry, even to death. Whoa. And the Lord said, you had compassion on the plant for which you didn't work and you didn't cause to grow. It came up overnight and it perished overnight. Should I not have compassion on Nineveh? These people made in my image that I love, their purpose in life is to reflect me, to be in a relationship with me. And now they're doing that. And you're angry about it? This is a cause for celebration. God's happy. Nineveh's happy. But Jonah refuses to share in that happiness. He's so consumed with his own emotional reality that he is isolated from the emotional reality of others. He's so caught up in what he's feeling that even when there is an appropriate emotion to experience based on those around him, he can't do it. He can't connect with it. He's incapable of empathizing with those around him. He's so cut off and consumed. He cares more about this stupid plant than he does about the people. Immature people are often unable to connect with the emotions of others. When someone has a difficult emotion like sadness or grief, the person who is emotionally immature is threatened by that, or they feel uncomfortable with that, and they try to fix it. They try to solve it. They step back. They hope it goes well for you. They leave, but they don't know how to connect with that person. Or if they're having a bad day and someone else is having a good day, they don't know how to celebrate with that person. Instead, their own emotions kind of drive their whole perspective versus the healthiest emotional people who are able to connect. They grieve with those who grieve, and they rejoice with those who rejoice. They express that empathy, that feeling with someone else. They know how to connect while remaining differentiated. That's emotional reality. I may not be feeling grief, but you're feeling grief, and so I can empathize with you. We ignore, we indulge, we isolate. 3 short-term habits of emotional immaturity. All right, enough of the immaturity. What does maturity look like then? Emotional maturity is when our feelings are subjugated to our thoughts and to our spirit. We don't allow our feelings to determine our actions without filtering them through the grid of our thoughts first. Jesus is the ultimate embodiment of emotional maturity. Right? First, we see that Jesus was conscious of his emotions. He didn't ignore them. I mean, if you just go through the Gospels, you'll be amazed if you just put the filter of emotions onto the life of Jesus. He expressed emotions with unashamed, unembarrassed freedom. I mean, just listen to some of the emotions that we read in the Gospels. It says that Jesus felt compassion. He was angry. He was indignant. He was consumed with zeal. He was troubled, greatly distressed. He was very sorrowful. He was depressed. He was deeply moved. He was grieved. He sighed. He wept on 3 separate occasions. He groaned in agony. He was surprised. He was amazed. He rejoiced very greatly. He was full of joy. He greatly desired. He loved. I mean, he's just kind of like checking off all the faces, right? It's a full emotional experience of a healthy individual. We see him early in his ministry at the wedding of Cana, where he's celebrating and he's joyful with these people. And then we see him late in his ministry when he's with the family of Lazarus and he's weeping with them. And of course, the irony is he doesn't have to weep with them because he's about to bring Lazarus back from the grave. He could say, "Stop crying. Watch this. Here's your brother back." But he doesn't. He connects with their emotional reality first. He grieves with them, and then he still goes ahead to kind of, quote unquote, fix the problem, but not before he felt what they were feeling first. No ignoring, no stuffing with Jesus. He's conscious of his emotions and the emotions of others. Second thing, Jesus controlled his emotions. He didn't indulge them. There are times when Jesus gets angry. There are times when you would see his frustration, his indignation, and you could imagine him reacting in the same way that we saw Judas react. Probably the classic example of this is in John 2. Remember, I showed the, last time I think I spoke, I showed the picture of Jesus flipping over the tables, literally flipping over the tables that AI had generated. But it says in John chapter 2, Jesus went into the temple and he found those who were selling oxen and sheep and doves for sacrifices. And the money changers were seated at their tables. Remember, the Jewish people, in order to pay their temple tax or to give their offerings in the temple, they would have to take their Roman currency and exchange it into basically Jewish currency. And so there was a whole side business of people doing that and not doing it at a fair rate of exchange, doing it like at a foreign airport where the rate of exchange is super high and they're making a whole business out of that need to convert money. And that pissed Jesus off. It's like, this is not the point. This is not what should be happening. You should not be making money off of those who want to come worship my Father. He's angry about it. And it says, Jesus made a whip of cords and he drove them out of the temple with the sheep and the oxen, and he poured out the coins of the money changers and he overturned their tables. I mean, Jesus encounters this injustice and he feels anger. And I think it's easy to read that through the lens of our own humanity and just think that he saw it and he reacted, kicking stuff over and flipping things, right? And it's like, man, look at the temper tantrum Jesus threw. And all the disciples be like, Jesus, that was crazy. You made that, you tore that thing up. But there's one detail in there that I think is so important. And it's this little phrase, he made a whip out of cords. He doesn't just start kicking over the table. He's like, I need a tool for this. but you know what? I kind of also need a timeout right now. And so it's like, I can imagine him going over into the courtyard and finding some cords, finding some, I don't know, whatever's laying around, palm fronds, and basically sitting down and kind of mumbling, I can't believe they're doing this every time I come here. Good Father, I have so pity. And just slowly weaving until he kind of, anger calms down. And all of a sudden now he's able to respond rather than react. And then he goes back in there with this whip that he's made, and he does an action that he feels is an appropriate response for what they're doing, but it doesn't personally harm anyone else. He's cooled off. It's a measured response. It's not an out of control anger. It's not punching the wall in anger when someone says something you don't like. Jesus controls his emotions. He doesn't indulge them. And then finally, Jesus connected emotionally with others. He didn't isolate. One of the key words in the ministry of Jesus is this word compassion. In the Greek, it basically means a feeling you have in your gut. You know, you've had those moments where you have an emotional reaction to something and you don't feel it in your head, you don't feel it, or you kind of feel it all the way down here. Jesus is often feeling in his gut for other people and with other people. He has compassion for the downcast and the distressed, who are like sheep without a shepherd. He feels compassion for the hungry and the weak. It says he felt compassion for some blind men. He felt compassion for a grieving mother who had just lost her child. He felt compassion for the lepers who were social outcasts. He shows up to Lazarus' family and feels compassion. He feels with others. He doesn't just identify it in that sense of sympathy. I know what you're feeling. That sounds like it sucks, but it overcomes him. My wife is such a great gift to me in this area. If you've ever done strength finders, like empathy is one of her top strengths. I thought I was empathetic. Like I've been a pastor, like I trained in pastoral counseling. I met my wife and I was like, yeah, I know what empathy is. You feel with someone, right? And then I watched my wife have empathy and I was like, I've never had empathy in my life. Like I will tell my wife stories about my childhood or just random things and she'll be crying. And I'm like, it's my story. Why are you crying? She goes, because this is incredibly sad. I'm like, yeah, you know what? Now that I think about it, it is kind of sad. It's like she's become like my vicarious emotional support animal, I was like, honey, I don't know how to feel about this. I'm just going to tell you a story and you show me what I should be feeling because you're a well-integrated, healthy, emotional being. And if you cry, I'll know I should be crying. If you laugh, I'll know I'm laughing. And this is just who she is. I mean, to this day, and people seek her out when they're going through hard times because they know Kristen will appear without any judgment. She'll appear and just sit with you in it. She'll get in that pit if you're in the pit. She won't try to get you out of it and rescue you. She'll say, as long as you need to feel this, I will sit here with you. And when you're ready to get out, we'll get out together. And this is the compassion that Jesus showed. Let me just close with this picture. There's a beautiful picture at the end of Jesus' ministry of Jesus and Peter, where I think you see this contrast again of what does emotional immaturity and emotional maturity look like. And it's on that last night, that Thursday night that we just celebrated of Maundy Thursday, where they had the Passover supper. Everyone knows that something is about to happen. Jesus has been building towards this. The town is abuzz. Jesus is preparing them. He's doing things that he's never done, like giving them rituals, say, after I die, keep doing this. And then he says, come out and pray with me. And he goes and prays to deal with his fear and anxiety. And then Peter, of course, falls asleep. And then suddenly the soldiers arrive. And Peter's fear and anxiety leads him to be reactive. He grabs a sword. He cuts off a guy's ear. He wants to lead a revolution in his anger. He's mad. He wants to be assertive, to be enraged, to express it. And then as soon as he realizes that's not what he's supposed to do and Jesus is not going to start an uprising, he drops the sword. Jesus gets arrested and then he just runs for his life. And now he's afraid. And so he literally lies 3 times to a young girl who's trying to identify him as a disciple. Peter never even makes it to the cross the next day to support his friend like John did, who's so much more of an integrated emotional disciple in these stories. That immaturity is so contrasted to Jesus' maturity, where he's processing his grief and fear and pain. He's feeling it much more than Peter even is. He knows what's going to happen. And yet he gains the sense of peace through his prayer time so that he's able to submit himself to the arrest. He's able to face his betrayer in Judas with an act of kindness. He remains composed at all these mock trials, knowing that it doesn't matter what he says. They're going to convict him. He's on the cross being physically tortured, and he's literally praying for forgiveness to those who are torturing him. His emotions are under his control rather than controlling him. Invite the band to come forward, and as we head towards communion this morning, which TD will lead us in a minute, I think it's just a reminder for us that this physical act of taking and eating the body and blood of Christ that Jesus commemorated or instituted on that one night, and part of inviting Jesus into our life afresh and anew is not just the Savior Jesus, but it's also the healthy, compassionate Jesus who has the power to grow us in maturity. None of us is fully mature in this area. Emotional maturity is a process, and we are all in process. But maybe even this morning as we participate in communion, the Holy Spirit would fill us afresh so that we may be more conscious of our emotions, more in control of our emotions, and have the strength to connect with the emotions of God and the emotions of the world around us.